Hello, I'm Lisa, and I'm an aspiring author who doesn't know what she's doing, Fantasy Map Edition. So I had an idea for a character and a general plot line, but I didn't know how to get started. So I decided to make a map and then just drop my character in at a random place and see what happens. So I spent months working on this map. I started with a GIMP fantasy map tutorial, which I'll link down below. But as I was following along with the tutorial, I realized I don't actually know how to make realistic fantasy maps. So then I started learning about tectonic plates and how they influence the world map elements like mountain ranges, volcanoes, and things like that. I'll actually link a really helpful video down below if you're interested in watching it. So to map out my tectonic plates, I used a software called G-Plates, and in the tutorial below it actually walks you through how to create it yourself. After adding the directionality and the outlines for my tectonic plates, I exported it as a 2D document, and then I uploaded it into my GIMP project. So this is what the 2D model of my globe looks like. After this step, I added dots to signify what's an ocean tile and what is a land tile, blue being ocean, green being land. And then after that, I used color coding to signify what kind of activities would happen in between those tectonic plates. And then lastly, I added climate zones. They're very similar to the ones we have on Earth, just so I have an idea of what kind of temperatures and climates would be in each level of the map. So after I had all of this set up, I started planning out my continents. I used just a fancy brush and started going in here and making these land masses. After I finished making what I thought were good land masses, I outlined them, and then I also moved them around so that way the map felt good to me. So after I was happy with my outline, I moved it to my continents folder. Now that I have the outlines of my continents, I would overlay the plate tectonic activity page so that way I would know what type of elements I needed to add on which continent. And then using this, I started adding my elements like forests, valleys, mountains, waterways, deserts. Now that I have my elements, I'll add a little bit more detail to make it pop more, so I'd add my Arctic biome, my highlights, and then my waterway strokes. After I was done making the continent layer, I started working on the ocean layer. For the ocean layer, I started with the base color. Then I overlaid it with my parchment paper just to give it a little bit more texture. I added an ocean gradient, and then I started manually putting in different ocean layers, starting with the darkest color and moving into the lighter colors. And then I added a coastline just to make it pop a little bit more. And that's my map. I did try to play around with some cartography features, but they just didn't feel quite right on my map, so I just decided to leave them off. After I finished building this map in GIMP, I printed it out, and with a pencil I started mapping out which areas different gods would rule. And of course I spent a ton of time researching the gods and what kind of societies they would rule. So I spent a lot of time on world building at this stage. And keep in mind, by this point I've written virtually no words. I would keep running into the issue where I would need to research something new before starting to write, and I had to have these answers before putting pen to paper. Most of the places on this map, as well as the world building that I did, I'm not actually using in my current story. So even though it was a very fun project, it did not help me actually write my book. If I was to do this again, I would do one of three things. The first thing is take a paper and pencil, and as I'm writing or right after my writing session, I would update it with any new places that are visited and try to keep a relatively close ratio to how long they're traveling and the lines and roads that I make. This way I can use it as a reference in the future if I'm making a GIMP map, and I can minimize the scope of my GIMP map so that way I'm not wasting time building out unnecessary elements. The second way I would do it is using a D&D map or tabletop map. Usually this is a grid-like map that you're able to write on with dry erase markers, but usually it's a little bit bigger than a standard piece of paper. And I would use that in a very similar way I would do with the paper, but then I would have a little bit more of exact measurements since it would be in a grid format. The third way is actually complementary to both the paper and the tabletop map, and that's to use D&D or tabletop tiles. So they're smaller cardboard-like tiles that you're able to write on with dry erase markers. And when I would use these for smaller locations or things you need to be a little bit more detailed on, for example, maybe the setup or layout of a bar, or maybe the positioning of where each character is sitting behind a booth, maybe even for an encounter or a battle sequence when you need to keep track of multiple characters at one time. For now, I do use a paper and pencil. I find it more manageable, and I update it after every writing session. I'd love to know how you go about your fantasy maps and your first drafts down below, but otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.